Welcome to the Overcommitted podcast, your weekly dose of real engineering conversations. I'm your host today, Erika, and I'm joined by...
Hey, I'm Bethany.
And I'm Brittany.
We met while working on a team at GitHub and quickly realized we are obsessed with getting better at what we do. So we decided to start this podcast to share what we've learned. We'll be talking about everything from leveling up your technical skills to navigating your professional development, all with the goal of creating a community where engineers can learn and connect. Today on Overcommitted, we are doing something new. It's a segment we're calling Closed That Tab. Each of us brings one thing we finally read, an article, a paper, a blog post, and we share what it was and why it stuck with us. Think of it as three engineers handing you the one thing from our reading pile that was actually worth the time. I am going to kick us off with my selection today. And surprise, surprise, it's about identity and agentic AI. The one that I read this week is by, I'm going to probably say his name wrong, so I'm sorry if you're listening to this, Khalid Zaki. And this particular post was about delegation in the identity space for agentic AI. So we think of authentication as saying, this is the user. Here's the way to know that this user is who the user says that they are. Agents, that is not always the hard part. So for agents, there's also this concept of delegation. And we have this for users as well, but for agents, it kind of takes on a whole new problem space where once you say the user user is who they say they are, they might then request escalated permissions. And so, they have a single identity and maybe you say, like, this agent has read permissions on any number of resources. Okay, great. But then what's preventing that agent from then requesting admin access? What guardrails do you have in place to say, well, now this agent is going to grant itself, additional permissions to do what it needs to do. So that piece is kind of the idea of delegation. Like, you're delegating permissions to this user in this space. How do you make sure that that doesn't escalate or balloon out of control? So he brings in some, known concepts. One of these is OAuth. So OAuth is sort of a token exchange. For a transaction, you say, hey, I have this token that proves I am who I say I am. The requesting resource says, okay, I recognize that. We do a token exchange. Here's another token to access this resource. And he argues that that is not quite sufficient for agents because it only grants on a specific transaction or specific action. So you might get, again, like an OAuth read token. Okay, great. But then, the next request might be an additional permission. And so he brings in this idea of context and context in sort of the identity lifecycle of a request or a workload. And so, so the agents sort of accumulate the context, they retry, they hand off. And then as you kind of get further down that request lifecycle, the original intent kind of drifts away from what you're originally executing. The idea is building into your system guardrails that help guide towards what the agent's actually supposed to be doing. He brings in this idea of attenuation, which is from another realm of science. I want to say it's physics or nuclear physics. Clearly not my area of expertise. So the idea is a credential can only be passed down in equal or lesser form. So an agent can get a token that has maybe write access. So then, write access to resource A, great. If that implies read access to resource B, great, you can get that token, but you can't ever escalate to admin. So building that in place to make sure that you're not escalating out of control. And there is a proposal out there on the IETF drafts called transaction tokens, which has a transaction ID. And so that's where you track that original intent, is on the token itself, saying any additional tokens that are granted are tied back to this original request. So that's kind of how you can track that and also audit it over its life cycle too. The other issue with only relying on OAuth that like sort of one-to-one is like you can't necessarily trace it back to the original request. Like you could be like, oh, well, this happened at this point in time, but like what was the original request intent? Where did this fit in the request lifecycle? Yeah, none of that traceability can happen with the OAuth flow as it exists today, but transaction tokens kind of like help you trace it all back to that original ID. So yeah, I thought this was really interesting. I'd never heard of transaction tokens. And to be honest, I had not really thought too much about this idea of like escalating permissions. Yeah, I feel like most of the tokens that I have used are like on behalf of. So like, using a token on behalf of myself, like my agent can't ever do more than I can do as a user, but I can definitely see how this can happen. Yeah, I thought it was a really good read. So we'll link it if you're interested to learn more. And yeah, if you have any thoughts on attenuation or know more about where that came from, also feel free to comment out and give us more context there.
I think that's so interesting. And it's such an important thing because I think like agents have known to go out of control. Like, I mean, we've heard of agents dropping database tables and things like that. So that is such an interesting thing and really cool that the field is looking into solutions there. Would the authentication pattern be like you give your agent like general access, like via the MCP, how you have to like sign into MCPs and then like per session you give it like a restricted access, or is it just like from the start you just give it that restricted access? If that makes sense. I might be framing it weird.
You're talking about like the issuing of a transaction token?
Yeah, like what point does that happen?
Yeah. And I guess it depends on what your use case is. Like if you want a single permission throughout the life cycle of a request, then great. I can also see it like, some kind of implementation where you only want like sub agents to have certain permissions or like short-lived elevated permissions. Like, yeah, you might want sort of a way to escalate just for that one request. But yeah, I will have to look more into, I guess, the details of the implementation. But yeah, I mean, at least knowing that it comes from OAuth, it's like you can kind of structure the token minting however you want. Like you can have an OAuth token live forever, or you can have an OAuth token expire after 5 minutes or 8 hours. And I mean, most tokens, it's best practice to expire them at some point and delete them, or, expire them and refresh them. So yeah, I would imagine some sort of short-lived usage.
Interesting. So I think just trying to understand this. So you sort of like you have like the rights to write to a repository, right? Right now, Claude just like reuses your GitHub token to push things. And so it looks like you did the thing when realistically like your agent did it. So it sounds like transaction tokens are a way to say like, all right, just for the scope of this one request, this is the maximum thing you're allowed to do within this up to and including whatever permissions you have or whatever. But then you could have admin access and then you could say like, all right, this agent can just push, like it can't, or like it can just read or something like that. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I mean, I would imagine that like, I don't know, in most worlds, like you wouldn't be able to delegate more permissions than you have. Like it would be very strange if like I only have read access and like I can create an agent with admin access. Like that doesn't smell right. Like also seems like a bad idea. But like, yeah, you would, instead of the agent acting on your behalf, you would like create more of an independent actor that sort of has its own defined permissions.
Yeah,
Which like exists today as like apps. A lot of people have these apps, but yeah, apps tend to work on like the OAuth protocol where you just get a token and then that token has its scopes. But this is more just like I'm reading this as kind of like metadata on the token of like,
yeah, what they're allowed to do, what they were trying to do when they were doing this thing. Yeah, I could see that being useful. That's also probably interesting documentation to have too, just for like making the agent better over time. It's like you could say like, all right, I'm going to feed all of this intent here, like see if you could optimize it somehow, or like, are we giving too much scope or something? Yeah.
Yeah. I guess what I didn't look into is like where all the information goes. I'd be very surprised if like all the transaction information is stored itself on the token. Like if the token itself is like a log of like every transaction taken, because then that token just like explodes in size and you don't want to be passing that around. So I'd imagine like you'd also have to hook it up to some kind of tracking on your end to be like, yeah, like based on this transaction ID, like this is how we're tracking the logs or something. I don't think the bookkeeping happens on the token itself. I would be very surprised.
Was it a good read overall? You recommend?
Thumbs up. Yes. Yeah.
Nice.
Good read. I mean, kind of specific, I guess, to the identity space, but also like it's a security question. So, could be interesting for anyone.
Yeah. I explicitly do not do much with auth if I can ever avoid it. But I am still really interested in that space because I'm going to eventually have to like authenticate, agents or whatever to do things on my behalf. So it's interesting to see how it's developing and how there are some very smart people thinking about that. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. And it also makes you think critically about some of these reports that are happening of like, it was like OpenAI, right? Who had the escalation recently, the security breach or whatever. And like, it makes you realize like, well, yeah, like, of course that happens because like these systems aren't set up for preventing that in their current form, but they need to be clearly, but there's major gaps currently.
I mean, that's actually a great transition because that's what my article is around, that incident. So I'll love to like look at this from the lens of like authentication and what could have been done there. But yeah, my article was from Simon Willison, and he posted about the OpenAI incident, which we'll go into in a little more detail. But I really like this article because I heard the story like on the news and stuff, and immediately I was like, okay, I'm a little suspicious there because I mean, OpenAI is trying to prove that they do AGI or they've achieved AGI, and honestly, their public blog post sounded something like almost a humble brag or a brag, like, oh, it's so smart. So I was like, that's interesting. But his blog was really helpful because it kind of mapped out the different phases of what happened here. And so the first part was like in May 2026, some researchers, I believe from UC Berkeley, UC Santa Barbara, and Arizona State, it looks like, they published a eval suite called Exploit Gym. And so we've heard a lot about Mythos and like all these like very capable models that are really good at finding vulnerabilities. But the scary part is being able to not only find exploits based on these vulnerabilities, but also chaining them together is something that is very sophisticated, very difficult to do. So Exploit Gym aimed to just be a eval suite for LLM models can do this. And so they published it to GitHub, so it was very accessible. And then a Hugging Face on July 18th was like, we were attacked by they said, Agentic security research harness. And it was interesting because with their investigation, they actually weren't able to use like frontier models to investigate this incident because most frontier models would refuse to respond to them because they had cyber blocks on trying to prevent people from like chaining together exploits and such. And so they actually had to use, I believe, models or open weight models. I don't remember which, but they had to use other models to actually investigate what happened and what breached their system. And then finally, a week later, OpenAI admitted to being did the attack, or that it was their agent harness that did this attack, and they're working together to figure out what happened. So I feel like the interesting parts here to me is that, I mean, OpenAI was running. It was a new model, they said, but the part about this, I don't think necessarily people are like, oh, it's the new model that's so capable. I'm not necessarily sure that's what happened, but it was like a model with all those guardrails like stripped away that was able to do this. And I believe they also used GPT-5.6. So I think like current class models could do things like this. They're just on those like heavy blocks. And so initially I was like, oh, did this actually happen? But I do think this all actually happened, and like everyone's being kind of upfront about what happened. Well, for the most part. Do you think OpenAI was very negligent in how it was handling these evals? Like, I think if you're going to strip away access or like guardrails, you should have decent observability of what's going in and out of your sandbox and understand what's happening there. Like maybe the model was just sophisticated enough to get around that monitoring. I don't know, but like I do think like there are some things that should have been in place to at least detect this early. I would love to know what you all think about this because I think there's a lot of like spiciness about it. There's a lot of opinions about this, and that's partially why I chose it because I just like to hear what thoughts are.
So yeah, my mind is stuck on the like chaining of vulnerabilities. Like, did they mention like what the specific path was that was taken?
I don't think anyone's actually reported what they were.
I guess that makes sense if they're not fixed yet.
It did say like when it was in the sandbox, it was doing a lot of like compute time to find internet access. And then it says to gain access, the models identified and exploited a 0-day vulnerability, which they have disclosed to the vendor in the package registry cache proxy. So they mentioned that, but then the only thing on the Hugging Face side, it said the model chained together multiple attack vectors, including using stolen credentials and 0-day vulnerabilities to find a remote code execution path. But unless it's been detailed more recently, I don't think they've actually reported what that is or what that 0-day is.
Yeah. I think my other initial takeaway is this feels more like a marketing tactic. Not that like it didn't actually happen, but pretty negligent in passing it off as sort of an academic exercise, but like really not being too academic about it. Like it sounds like they could have done a whole lot more to like monitor what was happening, be responsible about reporting it. Like I'm just thinking of like if there was a responsible red team doing this exercise, I think, having never been a security researcher myself, but like assuming that most responsible entities would be able to trace it back very clearly to like what the steps are that you're taking. And the fact that like it doesn't sound like they did a lot of that makes me feel like kind of gross about this in general, of like it kind of being more of a, hey, look what this could do, and like shock and awe versus like, actually moving forward the state of tech around these like security research efforts.
Since it wasn't supposed to have internet access full stop, like I think as soon as it got internet access, even though it was with a 0-day vulnerability, like that's when alarms should have sounded to see like if you're detecting traffic that's going outside of the boundary of the sandbox, you should be like, oh, this isn't good. But no.
I mean, I think that things are moving so quickly, and like these companies are so desperate to try and like prove that like they're going to be the ones to get there first or whatever, that like I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of this stuff was vibe coded, quote unquote, in the sense that, like AI is probably producing a lot of the code to make these things happen. And so I feel like it's probably pretty feasible for these things to happen and like somebody to be running an experiment without watching it that closely for it to like, just go off the rails like this. I think wasn't it for like a week though or something? It was a while that it was off the rails. So maybe you should check on your agents a little more frequently than that if it's lasting for that long. One of the things I recently read Empire of AI, which has been an interesting read. One of the things that it mentioned in there is like the way that OpenAI was originally got funding from Microsoft, I think it was, is like it's tied to them royalty sharing until they reach AGI. And then after that, they like the like Microsoft agreement or whatever cuts itself off or whatever too, or like changes in some significant way to where like they are very financially tied to proving AGI. And I feel like that's a very useful thing to know in regards to any like sort of announcement where you're like, oh, is this AGI? Nobody knows. It's going to be so hard to prove that something is AGI because we can't even prove like what human consciousness is, let alone like what machine consciousness is. So I think it's good to like keep that in mind every time something comes out. It's like, is this just marketing or
100%? Yeah, they financially benefit from something seeming like AGI or not. And I think, I could be wrong, I do think they defined some criteria of what AGI is, but I think the criteria, at least to me, maybe it's like, I almost feel like we're talking about like religion with how I'm like, AGI to me means this. I think it's just hard when these LLMs, the way they work is like statistical probability of like different words and things. And I'm like, nothing it says is truly unique in a way. Like it's all based on existing like training. But I mean, I guess so is human intelligence in a way, but it's just like very, very like hand wavy in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Vibes, as they say.
Vibes-based AGI.
Vibes, derogatory. Yeah. I mean, I think it's going to be really hard to prove that with any definitive sense because there's just so much like misunderstanding about what human intelligence even is. Like, how are you going to, even most neuroscientists you read from are like, we think we know what's going on in there, but like neural networks are really hard.
Yeah. But it's like, it's truly not helped by this sort of like misrepresentation that like, I don't know, hearing this story, it's like, okay, like the main thing that happened is it found a way to get an internet connection when it wasn't supposed to. Like, is that really newsworthy? Like, that's not really shocking that there's a 0-day vulnerability in like a cached package that it used. Like, I am really not shocked by that. But like this is passed off as, some kind of like indicator of AGI when it's like, I mean, if you have however many CPUs, can you find an internet connection? Probably. Like I just like really don't think that it's, it's being honest about what is actually going on and giving the perception that we're closer than we actually are. Like I doubt that in whatever AGI definition exists, like being able to find an internet connection is probably not on that list. Like,
I think if it was truly AGI, it would have used its knowledge of the 0-day to sell that on the dark web.
Yeah,
that's human intelligence.
That's true human intelligence right there.
It wouldn't have used it just to cheat on an evaluation. I think that alone proves it's not human level intelligence.
Yeah, spin up some kind of like Kalshi betting market to whether or not it is itself AGI. Yeah, that would have been.
That's it. We got it.
If you're listening.
Well, let's write up a paper and make it the new eval suite is how long it takes to just start profiting.
Start prop bets on its own behalf.
We'll call it Kalshi Gym.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Terrifying.
So thumbs up, thumbs down. Was it a good read? Simon Willison, everything he writes is worth reading.
Yeah, no, I recommend it. He does a really good job like laying out the facts. I do think towards the end he like varies like, oh, don't write this off as a stunt. And like, I don't necessarily agree with it. Whether it was like intentional or not, I'm like, well, they're using it for marketing. Like whether it was intentional or not, like, they're definitely profiting off of it now. So that was the only part where I was like, I think we can be a little more like in the middle ground with it. But I thought it was a very good article overall. And especially with how much like detailed knowledge a lot of these things have, like with exploit gen paper and things like that. I think it was a good read to break those down and give all the context.
Nice. Thanks for sharing.
Great. All right. So I am going to be sharing a blog post that I read by Adi Osmani called Loop Engineering. And this is one that it's been kind of a weird place to get to this. So I recently switched jobs and I noticed I started using the Claude superpowers skill. And it was really good to the point where I was like, all right, go do this thing. And all of my next prompts were always like, all right, yeah, continue. So I realized like, I wonder if I could just like automate putting all of this together in a way that like it would go check on, it would go create a pull request and then go make sure the pull request is passing CI and make sure that our like automated review signs off on it or whatever. And I put together this very cool like automation that I recently wrote about that's doing all of this from like some Obsidian files. And I realized like, this seems very, very neat. What is this? And I was talking with Claude a little bit about the whole setup. It's like, oh, that's called loop engineering. So yeah, I'll share my blog post that I wrote about accidentally discovering loop engineering, because this was a thing that I didn't intentionally find. But then I started reading about it to see like, oh my gosh, this is a whole area of like doing things that is actually really cool. And I feel like it's like the next phase of, I think we've said before on here how like cringy the word 10x developer is, but this is like legitimately 10x my previous output of like putting PRs out there and reviewing them and getting work done. So I feel like it's worth it without like the cringe factor potentially. But yeah, so with that, bear with me, please. So loop engineering is about replacing yourself as the person who prompts the agent, and instead you design a system that does that instead and actually like does the building for you. So some of the key points about it are like making sure there's like automations that are automatically like discovering things in your code base. So one of the things that I have is a loop that, takes bug reports or whatever and like feeds that into this system. Or I can like just go through the linear backlog and automatically add, linear tasks to this system and it just gets done. Or as I'm testing something, I'm still doing the same thing where like I am working on something synchronously and exploring the code base and like writing something. But then like if I come up with something, I'm like, oh, hey, Claude, go add this to the loop. And it'll go add it to the list. And now there's around 20 or so PRs, I think, that get closed per day just going through this loop process. And it's been really freaking cool, actually, because a lot of like the small bugs that I feel like I never have time to get to, or like the little UI things or whatever, like just go in the loop and then the loop takes care of them. And I just merge it when it's ready to be done at the end. So it's about like basically building another agent harness, but the agent harness is this like loop that's continuously running that is building things. A loop needs 5 things, according to Adi Osmani. Again, I did my own system without reading this first, so I don't know that it completely maps, but it's mostly the same. So it needs automations that go off on a schedule to do discovery and triage. That's something that I haven't quite built out completely yet, because I feel like I'm still manually adding things to the loop from like linear or whatever, or things that I find. But I do want to add that as a potential way to use it. Work trees, so agents aren't stepping on each other. I'm using Git work trees for that, because why would you not? I don't want my local checkout to be trampled on by the agents. Skills for writing down project knowledge that the agent would otherwise just be guessing at. So that's something that I built in as like a memory system to see like, all right, if you come across these blockers, like write down all the blockers you come across while building, put it in this one system and like start developing skills based on that to handle those things. Or, if it's a PR that could fix this, then go fix it and add it to the loop. Plugins and connectors. So to plug the agent into what tools you use. So again, that's typically the superpower skill. It seems like it doesn't necessarily need to use that as much. It's mostly like, unless it's like a big thing, it's mostly just going and doing it, but it's, doing the same sort of process that I use where it's like planning and then using that plan to like build the thing. And then sub agents, which is, so that I have like an agent defined that's like, this is a task worker that's going to go off and like build this thing and come back to me from there. That also helps, I think, to like keep things in its work tree, because theoretically any of those could break out of the work tree and go do their own thing, but they're told explicitly, stay here, don't go out of that. And then a sixth option too is memory, which is something that I guess I said. His article, he talked about memory being like the markdown file or the board or whatever that you're working from. But I feel like memory is also a very specific thing when you're talking about agents too, where it's like remembering things as it evolves. So I feel like that's kind of separate. But yeah, I feel like it's a good overview of it from my understanding. I feel like a lot of it is stuff that it's interesting. The blog post that I wrote ended up getting posted to Hacker News. It didn't go very high on the Hacker News site. It was like to the second page or something like that. But the comments were just as awful as I thought that they were going to be, where they're like, loop engineering, like, isn't this some other thing or whatever? Or there's other people who are like, oh, wow, you accidentally discovered how to push slot code. So there is that. But I don't know. I think it's a very interesting way to build. And I feel like this is like the biggest argument I think I've seen for how AI tools can actually make you more productive in a way that like is a step change above like actively doing the work and like pushing it yourself. Like this is almost completely autonomous to the point where like I just go through and test it and approve the PR basically at the end, and or request changes and have it be done as a different way. And it's been, I don't know, it's been very interesting. I feel like there's more and more things coming out. Like there's an adversarial code review tool that somebody at my job made that like I've just recently put in here. So it like roasts the code as it goes through to like try and make it better. And it does seem like it's improving the quality overall. But
how do
yeah,
you like,
thoughts?
how do you encode a stop condition to these loops? Because I feel like whenever I've tried to do like not anything that sophisticated, but like I'll get my code reviewed by AI, say to the AI, hey, respond to this feedback. It does. And then that other AI finds more things wrong with it. And then they just keep going back and forth, back and forth. So I'm curious, like, how do you encode a stop condition? Or is the model just good enough to kind of stop when it's like, yeah, this is roughly there?
Yeah, so I'm using the Claude/loop command, which if you don't pass in an interval to that, it'll just automatically stop once it like runs out of work. So my stop condition is everything on the board that it's currently working from, it can't take any actions on. And then the review tool that I'm using explicitly says like, all right, this is ready to approve. And that's when like that stops. Like there can be non-blocking things, there can be nitpicks or whatever, but like as long as there's nothing egregious that the review tool says needs to be fixed, then considering that approved. And then CI being green. I think that's the first step, is really defining like what does done look like, and then work out from there to build that, because yeah, that's sort of integral to the whole thing, is to figure out how to say that this thing has completed. Please continue.
Is there clearing of context between each loop cycle? Or like, do you find that it kind of like holds on to like prior mistakes or like prior conditions and in future iterations?
Yeah. So there's the agent that runs the loop is its own entity, and it just sort of manages pushing out the work, but they're not the one actually doing the work. It has sub agents that go and do the work and then bring back, the results, the PR that was pushed, and like any context that was kept from it. Then there's a memory file where like if there was an error that it came across, like, oh, this test was flaky or something along those lines to where it couldn't complete it, then it adds it to the memory file. And once, with like a counter as well, and once something has been in, I think right now I have it set to where if something comes up 4 times within the memory file, then like write a task to the loop to go fix it. And I've seen it go through and actually fix a lot of flaky tests or things that I would have never gotten around to. Like it found out that there was a flake around like 4 p.m. Pacific time or whatever, which is at midnight UTC, which is very like a classic, timing constraint issue where it was like trying to check the time on something. And it went and fixed it, which was awesome, because I was like, I would have never noticed that was a problem, I think. Yeah, it does a lot. I feel like maybe I just got really lucky with the way that it set itself up, but it's working really shockingly well to do that. I also work in like a fairly new code base. It was all written since AI existed. So it's, I think that is a big cheat code in it as well, because I can't imagine unleashing this on the monolith.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, it's kind of one of those ideas, like from my understanding of what you're describing, that like is not like, it's not necessarily like, I don't want to sound mean, but like it's not like groundbreaking, like, it's a loop.
Mm-mm.
Like, okay,
Yeah.
we learn, you learn loops on like day 2 of dev school. Like they're pretty like integral to what we do, but I guess the details of like how to integrate that with like an agentic system is the new part. And there are some details of like, knowing how to manage the context, knowing how to manage, like you said, the definition of done, like that. Yeah, that's kind of the learning piece here for me, is like thinking about those systemic inputs and outputs. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be pretty easy. So I have a repo too that I pushed all of the skills and worker and stuff to. You're welcome to try it out if you want and see. I think it'd be really easy to adapt at this point to whatever your like AI tool of choice is. It has like an onboarding loop, a skill to it too, where you can just go in and say like, all right, there's my definition of done. Let's work from here to build out something to your own way you build too. Because I think the one that I made is like very specific to how I work too, where I'm like, all right, here's where I think something is like completely finished. the things that I care about. So yeah, but I agree. It's not groundbreaking. It's just like piecing together a few other things, which is why I was like, man, this is really useful. And then I went and found out like, oh, this is a whole area of exploration that people are currently going through.
Yeah. It's kind of like an intuitive concept that you like now realize is actually has a name.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah. Cool. Well, this is super fun. Thank you both for sharing what you closed. I know it's always a motivation to share out like this to actually get things read. So yeah, we are going to go ahead and wrap up this episode. Thank you all for listening to Overcommitted. If you like what you hear, please do follow, subscribe, or do whatever it is you'd like to do on the podcast app of your choice. Check us out on Blue Sky and share with your friends. Until next week, goodbye.